Hello everyone, and welcome to Insights for Leaders. I'm Linda Ellett, and I lead our consumer, retail and leisure practice here at KPMG, and I'll be your host. And I'm wearing yellow because it's Go Yellow for Marie Curie, our national charity. Geopolitics and political uncertainty was given as the biggest threat to growth over the next 3 years by the respondents to our 2023 CEO Outlook survey. And the geopolitical situation hasn't improved since then, as major conflicts continue to grab the headlines. With around half the world's population likely to be voting on their governments this year, there's little prospect of more political certainty. At least there's been some good news on the economic front. The latest figures from the Office for Budget Responsibility suggest the UK could be on its way out of a technical recession. And the OBR believes that inflation will fall below the Bank of England's target of 2% by the summer. But just how positive a story is that? And will the measures unveiled by the Chancellor at the spring budget help drive faster growth and improve business and consumer confidence? I'm joined by a great lineup of guests today, and they'll be helping me work out how business leaders can traverse the geopolitical and economic uncertainty. We have Ben Fletcher, Chief Finance and Transformation Officer at the Very Group. Ben will tell us how his customers and people have been impacted by the geopolitical and economic situation and what it's meant for Very's investment plans. And we'll also get his view on the budget. We have Dr. Lindsay Newman, Head of Global Macro-Geopolitics at the Eurasia Group. Lindsay will give us an insight into the global political situation and how business leaders should react. And from KPMG, we have Dennis Tatarkov, Senior Economist. He'll share our latest economic forecast for the UK. And we also have, back with us, Tim Sarson, our UK Head of Tax Policy. Tim will reveal how close he got last month with his budget predictions, and importantly, what do the Chancellor's measures mean for business? We'll leave time at the end so that you can put your questions to our panel during our Q&A session. So please share your questions in the chat box on the right of your screen. And we'll be posing some questions to you too as our audience, so keep an eye out for those. If you aren't familiar with the Spot Me platform, please check the chat box for our top tips on how to get the best out of this event. Right, let's get started. Lindsay, let me come to you first. Thanks for joining us today. So, quite an incredible statistic that half the world's population could be heading to the polls this year. Are there any elections that you're keeping a particularly close eye on, or that our audience should be following?
Thank you, Linda, and thank you for having me. What is frequently overlooked about the geopolitical landscape as we're reading about it and hearing it in the news is how much of geopolitics is actually driven by local dynamics. So geopolitical dynamics and domestic dynamics are not disconnected. They are, in fact, very much interconnected. And as you say, this year offers a prime example of that because between half and a third of the world's population will be taking to the polls. And who will win those elections and the policies they will set will have impacts not just at home for those countries, but for years to come throughout the global landscape. Now, we at Eurasia Group have been thinking about these elections and how to sort of identify and think through the implications, and we've bucket them into two main groups. We've got continuity elections and change elections. So for those continuity elections, we're thinking here about India, where Prime Minister Modi, it looks set with his BJP party to take a third term. And he will likely look to pursue a number of those same policies, including market-based economic reforms, further economic growth, and continuing to position India on the global stage. Another big continuity election is Mexico, where it looks like, again, we're going to see leadership and policy continuity. Morena Party, is our baseline view, is poised to retain the presidency and both houses of Congress, not necessarily in a supermajority. Sheinbaum will be focusing in on energy, education, health, security, but no surprise, I'm sure, for the rest of the guests to hear that she will likely be fiscally constrained. Now, if we're thinking about change elections, we need look no further than right here in the UK, where Labour is expected to form the next government. This will be the first time Labour leads since 2010. And again, a fiscal story where policies like tax, social, workers' rights, it will all depend on that sort of margin of victory and the fiscal flexibility that I'm sure Tim Tim and others can share with us. And of course, we can't have a conversation about elections in 2024 without thinking about U.S. elections in November, likely to have very wide-reaching long-term implications. There's a lot of anxiety in Europe when we're thinking about not just who's going to occupy the White House, but just the fact that there might be further U.S. leadership change. And there are points of policy differentiation between a Biden 2.0 and a Trump 2.0. Lately, we've been hearing a lot about security space, the transatlantic relationship. In the extreme, there's worries that the U.S. could seek to, under a Trump 2.0, for example, to withdraw the U.S. from NATO, could reduce commitments on military assets, and in the extreme, we could see Article 5 degraded. Now, that's not our baseline view, but nor would we expect to see a conciliatory tone under a Trump 2.0. And so, our baseline view is that a second Trump administration would look to have a transactional nature in the security arrangement with Europe, with focusing in on bilateral relationships rather than multilateral engagements. And that's really the rules of the road for a second Trump administration, should we see it. And that won't just be in security and defense, but across trade, across energy policy, and a number of spaces that we'll all be keeping our eyes on.
Well, thanks, Lindsay. I think it's really helpful to think of it as those two categories as well. But it's not just elections that are creating this geopolitical uncertainty. We're seeing lots of other volatility around the globe. What would you say are the biggest risks that business leaders need to think about?
Volatility is absolutely the case, right, Linda? As you say, after the last 5-10 years that we've all had, the international system is reordering. It's remaking itself. And we have to think that there's going to be more disorder ahead rather than less. And it's that sort of framing and context in which we can understand February 24th, 2022, or October 7th. Now, it's important to say that both the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the ongoing MENA crisis were several of Eurasia Group's top risks. And that's because we are expecting more risk ahead. These were existing fault lines that in this disordered geopolitical landscape became activated. On the conflict in Ukraine, so no surprise, just going back to your first question, Putin did secure another 6 years in office this weekend. Again, that was a very well-expected continuity election. What that means for the Ukraine conflict, though, is that while we do see a tail risk around the potential for continued escalation, the trajectory here is really one of towards a stalemate in the conflict and an eventual partition of Ukraine. The ability of Ukraine to hold on to the current landscape, the current landscape and territory, will be very much dependent on ongoing European and U.S. support. U.S. support in particular has come under a lot of scrutiny over the last couple months. There's been a lot of uncertainty. We saw National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was just in Ukraine yesterday, and he feels very confident about the ability of the U.S. to commit another 40 to 60 billion. And so we're starting to see indicators that additional funding may come. On the conflict in the Middle East, now where Ukraine has sort of been in a steady state of the trajectory, as I said, moving towards a stalemate, the conflict in the Middle East is really at a near-term inflection point. And the big question overhangs is whether there can be a ceasefire agreement reached that could perhaps and potentially even avoid a Rafah offensive. And whether that ceasefire, if it is reached, can in fact even provide off-ramps or pathways out of this conflict. Now, the conflict itself has had very significant costs on Israel and on Gaza. We've all been watching. But it's important to also think about how it's not just that primary theater of impact. There's also regionally ongoing potential risk of escalation to Israel's north in the border with Lebanon. There's the question of the Houthis in the Red Sea, very much a continued live risk. We just saw, in fact, the Houthis have even been threatening shipping assets in and around the Cape of Good Hope. U.S. and Israeli relationship, a long-standing alliance, has frayed as President Biden looks to align policy and politics. And even in Europe, there's been conversation about whether the Israel-European trade agreement, the EU-Israel Association Agreement, should be reviewed. So we would really underscore the fact that we're not yet seeing how the Middle East crisis has had transmission channels to the global economic outlook. That would have to come through a very tail risk scenario around anything disrupting oil, either through the Suez, the U.S. deciding to impose additional sanctions on Iran, or because of, again, a very outsized tail risk scenario around the Strait of Hormuz. But it is a tail risk that would have very severe consequences.
I mean, we can just hear in that how many different aspects there are that people need to think about, and obviously most of them have a humanitarian aspect as well. But if we think for the business leaders in our audience who are trying to make sure their business is resilient, what would your advice to them be in terms of having some resiliency to all of this uncertainty?
Yeah, as you say, Linda, this is a high watermark for geopolitics.
Yeah.
I think it's clear that this is, that comes through from the survey that you mentioned at the start, and hopefully through my remarks. And so it's keeping the C-suite up at night. And we know this because from your survey, but also because mentions of geopolitical risks, mentions of geopolitics, all the risks that we're talking about today are making their way into earnings calls, earnings transcripts, security filings on an increasing basis. And it's everything from industrial policy to energy transition to the tariffs that we saw imposed under the first Trump administration. It's both intending to incentivize and constrain business. So it's leaving business really to have to navigate this environment, as you're saying. Now, during the pandemic, and because in part of the Russian sanctions, resiliency came to be very much associated with something about operational costs, in particular, something about supply chains. So we've all been in conversations, I'm sure, about how we need to de-risk, how we need to, how companies and orgs can bring their supply chains home or trust them with their friends, and moving from this just in time to building more redundancy in the system. But if geopolitics is really at this high watermark, we also need to acknowledge and recognize that it's not, that is a part of this resiliency story, but also geopolitics is driving markets. It's driving market outlook. It's driving economic outlook. And so what that means is resiliency also means building it into business planning and seeing it as foundational and fundamental to our market environment.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lindsay. I know that we're almost certainly going to be coming back to you in the Q&A because you're going to have triggered a lot of audience questions already, no doubt. Now, before we go on to our next guest and start to get into that question around the impact on the economy, let's have our first audience question for you. We'd like to know, as Lindsay says, what's most likely to keep you up at night as a business leader? Is it the geopolitical volatility? Is it climate change? Is it AI and other emerging technology? Is it the economic situation, or perhaps even another pandemic? Please put your votes in and we'll take a look at your answers later. But now it is time to move from politics to economics. Dennis, the OBR's figures suggest we're heading out of a technical recession and should expect growth of 0.8% this year. Is that in line with your economic view?
To some extent, yes. The good news is we do think the technical recession that the UK economy entered in the second half of last year will be over, and the UK economy will be growing from the start of this year. You can see this in some of the survey data, you can see this in some of the early GDP data, so there's good news there. We're not quite as optimistic as the OBR on growth. We think even with the economy growing in every single quarter this year, we're likely to see around 0.3% growth in GDP. And that's really a consequence of the low starting point after the technical recession. Then as we move into 2025, we think growth might accelerate again to 0.9. And again, this is slightly more pessimistic than the OBR have been, primarily down to the difference in assumptions around productivity growth. We think productivity growth is likely to be more in line with recent historical evidence and more likely to underperform than bounce back, as the OBR have just assumed.
Okay, and if we then think about maybe inflation, the OBR is suggesting inflation will come down below the 2% target. Obviously, we've seen a little bit of a drop today. What's our view on inflation?
Well, with inflation dropping quite quickly, we should see inflation back to the Bank of England's target of 2% very shortly, I think almost as soon as either April or May. So really, inflation is falling very quickly. It's falling rapidly. There are, of course, risks. Some of the risks is due to services inflation still elevated, and some of that is driving or is being driven by some of the internal price pressures. So firms still absorbing the wage increases that happened over the past year, and also the potential for supply chain disruption that's obviously we've seen in the Red Sea, and that could feed into higher goods prices. But overall, our forecast is for inflation to keep falling, potentially reach below the Bank of England's target of 2% later this year, but really falling very quickly.
Okay. And so then you know what I'm going to ask next. What does that mean for interest rates? Everybody's watching those carefully.
Yes. Well, we had the last MPC meeting today. The Bank of England decided to keep rates on hold, which we think they'll keep doing for at least until the summer. We actually think the first rate cut might come from June onwards. And we should see around maybe 4 rate cuts this year, taking rates back or down by about a full percentage point by the end of the year. So the falling inflation and economy still being in recession at the end of last year should give the Bank of England room to cut rates very shortly. Although I think they will take time to just see some of the latest data outturns, whether that confirms their view and the inflation is coming back to target in a sustainable way, is how they would put it.
Okay. Well, so I know from our research at the beginning of the year that we had 41% of consumers were feeling less financially secure at the start of this year compared to the previous year. Obviously, that sounds a little bit promising on inflation. Obviously, it's not prices coming down, but going up less slowly, and then potentially interest rates starting to come down. What are we starting to see in terms of consumer confidence changing?
Well, consumer confidence has recovered fairly sharply, almost in step with the drop in inflation, although it's still below its historical averages. So consumers are a little bit more hesitant potentially to go out and spend. Of course, as you say, falling inflation still means the price level is higher. Prices are higher than they were before the latest or the previous episode of higher inflation. So consumer incomes are still recovering, but they're recovering from a low level. As long as pay growth continues to outpace inflation, which we think it's already happening and will continue happening this year, we should see consumer incomes and consumer spending gradually recover this year. So overall, a positive picture, but it will take time for the recovery to feed through whilst consumer incomes catch up to where they were before this episode of high inflation.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why that mixed picture is why we're still not seeing consumer spending increase. So some categories are getting a bit of an increase, but that's mainly inflation linked. So volumes are still under a lot of pressure, and I know we'll come on to that a bit more later. Just one final question for you, Dennis, at this stage around unemployment and wage growth. You've touched on it. Do we think there's going to be less pressure around this going forwards?
Absolutely. I think, if you look at the labour market, most measures are pointing to some loosening, some less tightness in the labour market. Pay growth is gradually coming down from the peaks we saw last year. At the same time, if you look at some of the survey evidence, like the KPMG REC report on jobs, that does show that hiring is also down. There's some uncertainty coming from the revisions to ONS data, so that the rate of unemployment is almost at its record low level currently, which doesn't quite tie in with what we're seeing on the economic data. So overall, we're still seeing a loosening in the labour market. We think the unemployment rate will gradually edge up over the course of the next 2 years, but overall, labour market becoming less tight and conditions improving there.
Okay. That's really helpful. And Dennis, your next economic outlook is out next week, I believe. So that's something for all of you, our audience, to look out for. If you do have questions for Dennis or any of our other guests, please do remember to share them in the chat box on the right of your screen, and we'll be coming back to those later. So let's take a look at the results from our first poll question. We asked you what was keeping you up at night. Now, Lindsay, I don't know if that's just because you went first and you made everybody realise that this was a big concern, but actually a really kind of strong point on the geopolitical volatility. And I guess it's something that people don't feel they can necessarily control. And then again, obviously, the economic situation. So we've got a good choice of guests here. But any thoughts, Lindsay, on that result?
No, it's no surprise. I mean, this is what we've been hearing and, from our clients and helping them navigate through some of these key levers of, scenario planning and identifying tail risks and thinking through their timelines. Those are some of the key ways that, that we're helping our clients. And so it's really no surprise. It's, we see the headlines. It's the world we live in.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Dennis.
It's similar to what we would have expected. Geopolitical volatility is very, it's a big driver of economic performance. As I mentioned, a big driver of inflation, a big driver of longer term growth as well. So again, this is quite consistent. And of course, economics is always important. So seeing that come second in the poll is no surprise.
Well, hopefully maybe by the end of our session and the Q&A, some of our audience might sleep a bit better tonight because you'll have given them some thoughts. Tim, I know we're going to come to you more broadly, but your thoughts on that?
What this shows to me is the importance of fashion in people's views as to what to worry about. Just a reminder to everyone, we're currently in the second in the row of the warmest years on record globally, and I would argue that a lot of that 43% of geopolitical volatility over the last decade or so is probably at least directly or indirectly driven by climate change. So 5% is a little bit depressing, to be honest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think maybe we need that topic on our next session. Ben, I don't know whether you would have agreed with our business leaders if you'd been voting on that and put those two topics. What's your thoughts?
I certainly would have had economic uncertainty at the top of my list, but then probably I'd have gone for AI and tech afterwards, because I think certainly in our business as an online digital business, we're having to think really hard about the role that tech can play in doing a better job for customers, but also creating economic efficiency benefits that we can then put back into the proposition that we put in front of customers. And that's something we really feel that we're learning a lot about at the moment.
Okay, so those two top of mind then. So Ben, let's stay with you now. Thank you very much for joining us today. We heard a little bit from Dennis there around consumer confidence. You know, how are your customers feeling? What are you seeing?
Well, we should probably just quickly describe who our customer is to answer that question. So we have the benefit of being an integrated retail and financial services business. So we see how people are shopping, but we also see how they're managing their household incomes as well. And our customers is what I would call a great mum, normal mum. Late 30s to early 40s, 2 kids, average national earnings. And there's no question at all, both through the data on their shopping habits, but also what we hear from them qualitatively, that the cost of living crisis is very much top of mind and is influencing behaviour. People are wanting great deals. It doesn't mean they're not shopping at all, but the proposition has to be right. You have to be able to offer the right product at the right price. And certainly one of the things we focused on is how do we make sure our retail proposition is presented in the best possible way. And they're able to articulate, when you hear them qualitatively, all the pressures that are being experienced on their household incomes. That said, just to sort of perhaps inject a note of positivity, one of the things that has surprised me is how resilient customers have been. And again, both looking at it qualitatively and quantitatively, when we hear our customers talk, having described all the challenges of the cost of living crisis, they'll immediately move on to say, really looking forward to that holiday this year, wherever, Spain, Portugal. And there's a commitment still from a spending point of view to do things that are important to them. The second thing that we've paid really close attention to is that financial health and resilience. And in the last 6 months of 2019, just before the pandemic, we look at the arrears rate on our debtor book as a financial services business. It was about 4.5%. So immediately pre-pandemic, 4.5%. We just published our results for the same period in 2023. It's 2.5%. So in terms of the financial resilience that our customers, who, as I say, very representative of an average household in the UK, that they're experiencing, the evidence is it's got somewhat better. Why might that be? I think we under-discuss the capacity that was built up during the pandemic. And there was household economic resilience, I think, built up during that period that it's been relied on. I think the rise in interest rates have had less impact than they would have done 10 to 15 years ago from a speed point of view because of the number of fixed rate mortgages within the system. It takes time for that impact to feed through. And I think the fact that it has been a cost of living crisis that's nonetheless been pretty much full employment has given consumers more confidence to lean into purchases when they see something that they like and find compelling. So I'm slightly more optimistic. Dennis is 0.3%. You'd be really disappointed with that, I think. And of course, the challenge for the economy is to get that number up to 2.5–3% on a long-term basis if we want to be able to have the public services we want and the right state of the public finances.
Yeah, well, definitely like to hear a bit of optimism there, Ben. And I think you touched on there as well about there's certain categories that are doing well. And again, we see that travel is doing well. People do want to still get away and have that treat. So I think as a business being really smart about where you focus. And I guess on that note, part of your role thinking about the investment priorities for Very Group, hearing about the geopolitics, hearing about the economics, how does that influence your investment choices?
Well, it certainly does. As Lindsay was saying, we've had to reconcile ourselves now to living in a world of non-stop volatility. And the truth of the matter is there was a long period of, let's say, 15 years of low interest rates, low inflation, low volatility. It's actually pretty benign. And very quickly that has changed and we've had to adjust our mindset and approach. And what we've found is it's really forced us to think about what actually matters. In a benign environment, you've got more latitude about where you focus and how you spend your money. We've had to be really, really focused about what it means, not just, but partly because rising interest rates has caused our cost of capital to rise. So the first thing we've got certainly more focused on is, does this investment idea meet the hurdle of what our marginal cost of capital is, really confidently? It's got to be able to deliver that outcome from a financial point of view. The second is, will the customer notice? Are we spending money on something that is going to cause a customer to either come to us for the first time, come to us for an incremental basket during the year, or spend more when they're shopping with us regularly? Is it actually being seen by the customer? Because if not, why are we spending the money? And then the third area is we've got to use the opportunity of the volatility and the pressure to become more efficient. And that's not something that we want to be embarrassed about or kind of secretive even with our colleagues. We actually ground it in what our customers are experiencing and saying that we need to be as disciplined, frugal and imaginative as the customer that we serve. They have a right to expect that. And we need to apply that mindset into the way we run our business so that we can be really confident that what we do makes a difference to the customer and creates the resources to be able to invest for the long term. Probably one other thing about amongst us, you've got to have a couple of anchor points. Because otherwise you sort of feel like you're buffeted from one event to another, and having an absolute lodestar of what it is you're there to do for your customers, I think gives you the best place to do that. But then I think the other aspect is we don't know what's going to happen next. And therefore having access to great advice, great partnerships, great perspective, actually we've found at a board level, we have to get much more externally focused than we have been previously in order to understand the world around us, but have people with us because we're not going to be able to do everything, know everything, respond to everything on our own. You have to be more engaged with the world around.
Yeah, absolutely. Get that external perspective
Totally.
with people that totally understand what you're aiming at. And you've used the word customer a lot there, which I'm not surprised about and I love to hear, but lots of businesses say they're customer-centric. But can you just share some of the things that specific to you do at Very Group to really drive that customer centricity?
Well, that's right. I mean, any retailer sat here will talk about their customers because it's what we all love. I think the first thing to acknowledge, actually, sometimes there are really real challenges to being customer-centric. A lot of my life is spent thinking about our bondholders, credit insurers, ratings agencies, owners, quite all wholly legitimately. My operations colleagues are thinking really hard about how do they run a leaner, more effective operation. So we all bring our functional concerns to the table, but actually, real sustainable value is created by winning the long-term loyalty of your customer base. And sometimes the functional and institutional pressures on boards and leadership teams can trump the customer. And so one of the phrases I heard a long time ago, and I've tried to stick with, is life's a lot easier when the customer's in the room with you, because it really focuses you on are you doing something for them. And so the way we think about that at the Very Group, and we've got a challenge which I've only really learned by moving into a digital retail business out of bricks and mortar ones, is we can't walk into a shop and see a customer shop. So we have to work really hard at it. And in order to get that a qualitative perspective alongside the data, that means non-stop research into what our customers are thinking and feeling and talking with them, but also having that played in. So every company-wide briefing, we start with what a customer's saying, actually saying videos of customers talking about us and their lives. We work really hard through our colleagues in the contact centres that we have to understand the feedback, the verbatim feedback that we're getting, going into their homes to understand how they're shopping and living and what it means for them. So that you get the complementary perspective about what's going on. We build it into our learning and development programs. In fact, I know I've sort of guiltily got one sat in my inbox at the moment that I know must be done, but it's about our quarterly customer closeness so that I understand, as all colleagues do, what it is that our customers are experiencing and thinking. And so you really have to work at it because it gets crowded out quite easily.
Brilliant, I love that. It's just, constantly working at it. You can never tick that box.
Yeah, and it's not the responsibility of a team to know the customer. Yeah. It's the responsibility of everybody. If I think about the finance team that I lead, we have a huge responsibility to make sure resources are allocated in a way that would deliver a real benefit for customers. And we've got a real duty to explain how we think about the company's future to the outside world in a way that is always grounded in the customers. And actually, I find it most easy as CFO when I'm going and doing our results presentations, if I can describe what a number means and relate it to how a customer is behaving. This number makes sense because the customers are doing this. It's the most grounded way of understanding the business.
Brilliant, I love that. And then Ben, just my last question for now, turning you onto your people. We heard from Dennis around that Economist view around the labour market and wages. In terms of your people and your ability to recruit and retain, how has that impacted you?
It's definitely an evolving picture. I recognise what Dennis was saying about the labour market. If I go back a couple of years ago, there were pools of talent that actually were really hard to come by. It was fiercely competitive. Operational colleagues, so at the time in particular when online was going through a real growth spurt, getting hold of colleagues to deliver your proposition in warehouses and through logistics was hard fought. Similarly on tech, those were particular pools of capability that were hard to come by. That's eased, I would say, over the last year or so. I think that's a reflection of the changing nature of the retail market over the last year. But also some of the dynamics that Dennis was describing. The same is true from a pay point of view. I think pay has come off its peak, and I agree that as inflation falls, but pay runs ahead of inflation, that will really help from a household income point of view, and it'll help our colleagues as well. I think the other aspect is colleagues are somewhat fatigued, is what I would notice. They've been through an awful lot. A pandemic and a cost of living crisis, and alongside all of that, there's a daily diet of crisis-led news, whether it's a climate change crisis, whether it's a security crisis, and that's just what I noticed is that's just causing a bit of mental fatigue in colleagues. And so one of the things we do try and take really seriously is how do we have the networks and the support, frankly, to keep people's spirits up, because at times it can just feel really tough for colleagues day in, day out.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think most businesses would recognise. Yeah. Thanks, Ben. I'm sure, again, we'll be back with more questions. But right now, we've got another poll question for our audience. In our first poll, we asked you what's worrying you. Now we are going to take a more positive outlook. And we'd like to know, where do you see the biggest opportunity for growth? So is it AI and emerging tech? Is it sustainable initiatives, noting Tim's comment? Is it mergers and acquisitions? Or perhaps reinvigorated international trade? And we'll take a look at your responses later. But now it is time to talk to Tim, our UK Head of Tax Policy. Tim, great to have you back. Careful, you're becoming a bit of a fixture. You joined us last month to give your budget predictions. We've had the budget. What were the headlines?
So I don't know if you're going to then play what I predicted before if I get anything wrong, before I start sort of claiming that I predicted it all perfectly. But I think a lot of what was in the budget was not unexpected. In really broad terms, we thought this was the last budget before the election. That's probably one prediction that we got wrong, because it now seems like there'll be an autumn statement before an autumn election. But it was always going to be a very electioneering budget. It was always therefore going to be about, or more focused on, individuals and individual taxation than on corporate taxation or broader business taxation. To be fair, businesses had a lot of focus over the last few statements. And in fact, back in the autumn statement, of course, making full expensing permanent was the big thing. So it's not like that businesses have been ignored. But so that focus on individual taxation was unsurprising. The fact that there was a cut in NI rather than income tax was widely trailed. I think we all knew that although there were some who would have quite liked some reform to inheritance tax, that was always going to be politically very, very difficult. A couple of the things that took me by surprise, it depends on, I can't remember how far before the budget this last month was, because of course everything leaks out these days. So you sort of, your predictions evolve. And that sudden shooting of Labour's fox on the non-dom regime, reforming that was I wouldn't quite call it a political masterstroke because it doesn't seem to have registered in the polls. But what it did do was it took, in a world where there's very little money to play with, where all the demographic trends and where our productivity and economic trends are sort of going in the wrong direction, but the needs of public spending are sort of ever rising, particularly on health and social care. There's always going to be very little to play with. The one little piece, or one of the very small pieces that the opposition were proposing to use in order to do some of their investments, was reforming non-doms. Hunt has then taken that and used it to fund a cut in NI. It was quite interesting as well in terms of how they made the numbers add up, that they've chosen, and I'm sure we'll have a view on this, Dennis, they've chosen to shrink even further our fiscal headroom rather than what I think a lot of us expected, which was have sort of unrealistic spending cuts programmed in for 2025 and onwards. Now that shrinking of fiscal headroom, and fiscal headroom is, okay, it's partly a fiction, it's partly all about, well, what rules do you set yourself in the first place? But that sort of implies a policy position, which is that all the surprises have happened now. We're not going to have another pandemic. There's not going to be another shock to whether it's inflationary. I mean, we're so tied in terms of our fiscal balance now to inflation and interest rates, because so much of our debt is index linked, and that's one of the things that has really shrunk our sort of ability to play. So they've chosen that. It kind of means that if anything goes unexpectedly, or if those OBR predictions are, slightly out of kilter, then the ability to make a splash in this autumn statement before the next election is going to be pretty restricted, I would have thought.
No, thank you. And I suppose given that slight change of focus, maybe for our business leaders, what do you think they should be doing in as a reaction to this budget?
So, well, one of the things they ought to do actually is don't be misled by the fact that it was largely a budget about individual taxation, because there were a few interesting changes, quite fundamental changes that are being programmed through those budget announcements that potentially affect them. Non-doms is an interesting one, because if you're a large employer, particularly in the southeast of England, particularly if you're in a sector like financial services or technology, you will have quite a lot of high-paid non-doms in your workforce who are affected by this and might have arrangements affected by this. So it's something that you ought to be thinking about in terms of your overall remuneration strategy, how you retain talent. But that aside, there are a couple of things that are quite interesting. There's a consultation that's been launched on extending full expensing to leased assets. That's most relevant for finance leased assets. Essentially, it's operating leases. You get a deduction as you pay as you go along. Really important that companies, if they are affected by this, or if they are investors in assets, and particularly those who use leases, they respond to that consultation, because it's actually quite a big deal, and it's one of those things that could shift behaviour. The other is we've got a few months into an election. All the politicians are in listening mode. Actually, not just the Labour Party, and I think a lot of businesses have spent a lot of time recently that maybe they weren't spending a few years ago on listening to and trying to get Labour front bench to listen to them, but also the existing government and the Treasury and HMRC. Those people are going to be in post both before and after the election, and I think talking to them, particularly about the practicalities of tax reforms that might happen over the next couple of years, is really important, so that they're in a position then to brief any incoming government.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I suppose linked to that, we heard Lindsay say that the expectation was a change in the UK to a Labour government. What do you then expect from a tax perspective if that is the case?
So on the surface, not huge change. So there are certain things you won't see changes to because there's actually a reasonable amount, either because there's ideological consensus or because the numbers don't add up if you do it a different way. So the corporate tax rate, it's at 25, or it's gone to 25%, it's going to stay at 25%. They're not going to shift that. We're not quite at the stage yet for a major overhaul in VAT. I think that will come in due course because automation, digitalisation of VAT renders that sort of regime a bit pointless. You might as well just have an end tax on consumers. And I don't think we'll see an unwind of full expensing. We won't see a massive overhaul of the R&D credit regime. A lot of the fundamentals of the UK system are going to remain as is. And some of the things that have been announced as differentiators really only affect one or two small sectors or subsectors, like Labour have talked about a proper windfall tax for upstream oil and gas. Well, of course, that was another thing that Hunt announced an extension of. I think what you will see beneath the surface, though, is a two-stage approach. So Labour very keen early on to recreate, as they see it, stability and certainty in the system. And I'm hopeful that that might mean, for example, bringing back a lot more opportunities for businesses to get upfront certainty on their own tax positions, a sort of proper ruling regime, which we haven't had in the UK for many years. But then 2 years into the Parliament, so don't focus just on the manifesto. A couple of years into the Parliament, people particularly on the backbenchers will be starting to get a bit sort of twitchy, and we'll be looking at the next big thing. And I think the soft left of the Labour Party in particular, that's when I would expect to see a little bit more activist industrial strategy. So, okay, the 28 billion has been dropped on net zero investment or has been sort of scaled down, but actually starting to see either tax breaks on activity that government really likes and wants to encourage, or seeing sort of punitive or targeted taxes on things that it doesn't like. I would expect towards the back end of that Parliament you might see more of that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. That's really helpful. We're going to look at the results of our second poll in a minute, but just before we do, Ben, I was interested in, as a business leader, your reaction to the budget as well.
Well, a couple of years ago, we were treated to a budget that was way too memorable. So on one level, we'll take what came out recently. And I think what you can start to see is, having stabilised the situation, I think you can sort of see a thesis emerging from Jeremy Hunt about kind of what he would continue to do if the government were to be re-elected. I think full expensing has been an important part of that he's brought in. The interest in how national insurance and income tax might work together, and there's some kind of carrot dangling around what that might look like in the future, although it's not fleshed out. So on one level, great not to have anything that scared the horses. I think some interesting incremental moves forward. I think for me, my overall observation is we have got a growth problem and we've got a productivity problem, and we have to become much more serious about solving those. And that does require the kind of stability that Tim was just describing, but I think it requires a lot more boldness in terms of what's needed. We've got a tax system that, for several different taxes, has been bent out of shape by annualised incremental tinkering in budgets and autumn statements. Tax base is too narrow on different taxes, which is why rates are too high. That is bending marginal rates completely out of shape. I think there needs to be what would be ideal is a thoroughgoing reform of the tax system, allied to a reform of the planning system and proper investment in early years skills, so that over time we're building an economy that is able to grow faster and be more productive to create the resources that we need for public services and a more stable economic future. And I think we haven't really had that now for a long time, and the economy's been transformed by technology and the way consumers shop and experience things. The tax system and the planning system and our approach to infrastructure needs to catch up with all of that.
Yeah, isn't there ready to enable that longer term
Absolutely,
thinking? So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And be great to see politicians have a bit more confidence in the electorate's ability to deal with those ideas.
Yeah, I won't go down that rabbit hole, but yes, right. So it is related though, because you talked about the need for growth and productivity. So we asked you, our audience, what do you see as the biggest opportunity for growth? And we can see our poll results here. So over half of you see the biggest opportunity as AI and emerging tech. And then coming in second place, sustainable initiatives. So, I mean, Ben, you said AI and emerging tech would be key for you as well.
Absolutely. And we're learning about it. I think we see really clearly the power to transform the way in which we work and the way in which we're able to deliver our proposition to customers. We know that machine learning is going to be able to do more than kind of human skill is going to be able to do. And we know that part of the future is where it's not just about processing better, faster, more effectively, but actually content origination is going to be different off the back of all of this. And so we think it has the potential to transform not just our kind of operating model, if you like, but the quality of the experience that customers have. We have to be both open-minded and a little bit skeptical, because you can sort of hear these things and think, right, okay, we can transform everything, and that is not always the case. I think there is one thing, though, that it's incumbent on business leaders to think about, which is what's the skills agenda alongside technology. It's no good installing ChatGPT alongside all your Microsoft Office tools as a starter if you don't teach anyone how to use them and ask a new question. I think the other aspect to it is the more in which certain roles become automated away or certain skills become more standard to a higher level, we're going to have to think about our investment in the skills that only humans can do. The creative skills, the judgment, the ability to create a judgment, to discern, to imagine. Those are going to become skills we're going to need to invest in for the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we think about growth, it's not just the tech, it's everything around
Absolutely,
that. So
it's the whole
I think
system.
That's really important to remember. I mean, again, just looking at the poll results, I mean, I don't know, Lindsay, any thoughts in kind of the politics around all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, we're very engaged in the AI policy space and sort of the future trajectories there. For Eurasia Group, we had governance of AI as one of our top risks for the year. You know, we're hearing sort of in that space that there's governance gaps. We all know about that. We also are concerned in the election year of the risk of misinformation, but it really is an opportunity story. AI really is an opportunity story. And I would just say, to Tim's point earlier, they interlock, right? So AI developments and capabilities will help us unlock sustainability challenges and climate change challenges. So that's really the focus for us.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'm conscious of time, so I do want to move on to Q&A. So we put some of your questions, our audience, over to our guests. Let's start with one here. Dennis, I'm going to ask you this one, but very much from an economic perspective. The question is the reduction in birth rate a good thing? So please answer from an economic perspective, but it's commenting on the reduced environmental impact and reduced demand to housing that comes obviously in terms of kind of population dynamics. So what's your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think in general, there are some limits. Obviously, limits space, some limits to growth. But I think in general, these kinds of factors should roughly balance out, because obviously, extra population create demand and create supply. So it's more of a thinking from a balanced growth point of view. If you look at maybe some issues like capital stock, you could see some improvements there. So there might be some demographic dividend from a lower birth rate, but equally it also limits the overall growth of the economy. And kind of, if you look at the longer term, it means between now and maybe 30, 50 years in the future, you are looking at an overall smaller market. So there's pros and cons to this.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Dennis. So we've got one here. Tim might ask you this one in terms of the current environment, so economics confidence, how that's impacting investment decisions in relation to tech and ESG and people. And obviously, Ben made the comment earlier as to whether the sort of tax environment was keeping up with business and enabling business to invest in these areas.
Yeah, so obviously some of it is economic cycle dependent. Some of it is just about how much money businesses have got in their pockets to spend. But I think a lot of it is also driven by the regulatory and the government structures that businesses are operating in, and tax is part of that. It's not the only one. I have to think about those opportunities there. So AI and tech, sustainability, expanding international trade. I'm really pleased at the eternal optimists, the 11% who think that international trade is going to get better over the next few years. They're obviously banking on a Biden win. They're all driven by they're all driven by the need for certainty in what a government position is. And I think if you're looking at inward investment to the UK, particularly in areas like green technology, but also in any area, whether it's life sciences, broader tech, financial services, where regulation has a part to play, and also where tax incentives like our R&D credits, like the way that we deal with capital allowances, have a part to play. Certainty and knowing what you're letting yourself in for are really, really important, or certainly as important in certain parts of the economy as the fact that we have a fantastic big consumer market here in the UK, which is one of the reasons obviously people invest. And I think maybe as a country, we're starting to emerge on the good side of things there, because we've had our, fingers crossed, we've had our sort of geopolitical crises over the last few years. We had Brexit, which really sort of muddied the water around UK investment. And then just as we were sort of starting to get over that and get Brexit done, we then had a pandemic. We're now in a scenario where actually the UK is looking at least as stable, notwithstanding changes of government, elections, etc., at least as stable as an economy as a lot of our European counterparts. And so once that stability comes back, we have a lot of strengths in this country. If we could just tweak our tax system, because I don't think we're going to have a massive overhaul just yet, but I absolutely agree we need it. But in the short term, if we can tweak things so that more of our system is not geared towards giving people windfalls after they've invested. That's the problem with things like our R&D credits regime, that you put in a claim and then a few years later after you've been audited, if you've got the credit or not. We should have the ability to get certainty on something up front, so that then when we're doing those NPV calculations and we're working out what the return on investment is, we can see, we don't have to be prudent. We can see what we're going to get. So if we tweak a few things like that, I actually think the macro position for investment in the UK now is reasonable. It's not like it was in 2016, 2017.
Okay. Yeah, well, and maybe that can give people a bit more confidence as well around their investment. Thanks, Tim. Lindsay, I've got one. This is a great question. We've seen increased cultural polarisation, especially in the US. How should businesses react to that?
Yeah, absolutely, Linda. I mean, we had this, again, as one of our top risks, sort of risky business. It's a phrase I quite enjoy. The issue here is that depending where you're operating in the U.S., you might find yourself in a red state, in a blue state. There's just a spectrum, and it's not just about policy, it's about politics. And so it goes back to our point earlier about how do business navigate and operate in this tricky environment. And depending on where you're actually doing business, you may have to be more aware of the politics than not. It is a U.S. trend, but it's important to note it's not only a U.S. trend. We do see protest movements and boycott movements in Europe as well. But in the U.S., it's becoming not just sort of an operational issue. There are legal cases and judgments that are going to be making their way through the legal system on both sides of the aisle, affecting business.
That's really useful. Thank you. Ben, I've got one for you here. People would like to know whether your business has been impacted by all the supply chain issues. There's obviously a few of our audience out there that are feeling the challenges of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, just before answering that question, listening to Tim made me think of something, which is there's a brilliant book by Paul Johnson of the IFS called Follow the Money. I don't know if you read it, Tim, but if you want the beginner's guide to understanding the tax system and how the government spends all your money, it's a fantastic book for non-economists and non-tax experts to understand how the whole system works. And I can really recommend it as anyone who's interested and wants to begin to build an understanding of it. In terms of supply chain, yeah, absolutely is the truth. Now, we've been able to manage the impact on our business well, I think, actually, better than we first anticipated. And whether that has been, you think about at the time of the pandemic, hugely disruptive to supply chains. Now we've got the issues that Lindsay referred to in terms of Houthis and the Red Sea. They're absolutely going to have an impact in terms of the speed with which product arrives within the UK. We actually found that a lot of our Brexit contingency planning has proved to be incredibly useful. And one of the lessons we've learned is that actually it's worth keeping your contingency planning live, even if the event for which you've planned has passed and been navigated successfully. The other thing that's helped us is something that I referred to a little bit earlier, which is we, like all retailers, run our supply chains with partners and with other experts, and being able to rely on their early intelligence, know-how and responsiveness is going to be important. And it's when you've been doing that together in a high-quality partnership for a long time that ability to respond and be agile and understand the different dynamics is there. And we keep learning the fact that we can only do it really well with partners who bring an expertise that would be hard for us to replicate.
I think part of what Ben's saying is also about honing the risk profile. Not every company has the same risk profile. You know, some will see a risk that develops and say, look, we have to pull out of this market. And others will say, we understand the risk. We have, as Ben said, a network of advisors near and far, and we are going to stay in this market because that's what makes sense for our business. So it's really about also honing and identifying that risk profile.
Brilliant. Totally. Thank you. And I'm just going to pick up one final question, which is around China. Maybe Lindsay, Dennis, you can each just give a quick view around political situation, economic situation on China.
So we've been thinking about the U.S.-China relationship as a bit of a red herring for 2024. And that's not because it's not going to have tectonic implications for the global system, but it's because of what I said earlier, which is that so much of geopolitics is domestically driven. And the U.S. obviously has the election at home this year, and China, perhaps Dennis can talk to you, the economic outlook is constraining what its ambitions are for 2024. So our headline right now is for 2024, we're expecting to see just a sort of managed decline in the relationship, tail risks around any sort of escalation in friction.
Brilliant, thank you. And Dennis, the economic position?
Well, on the economics, I think obviously the Chinese economy is still being held back by the situation in the property sector. And I think if you look at the growth rate, at least in 2023, it has been relatively disappointing. I think looking ahead to this year, I think any stimulus, any support from the Chinese government will be crucial to achieving their relatively ambitious level of growth. And I think in the absence of that, we are expecting, well, a gradual slowdown in China's growth rate.
Brilliant. Thank you both. I mean, the time has flown today, I think, with all these topics. Thank you to our audience for questions. It's been a fascinating discussion today. I think big takeaway, we're living in a volatile and uncertain world. And as leaders, we all need to understand what's going on in the world, both in the UK and elsewhere, and then being as agile as we can in order to adapt to that change, but also influence it where possible. I'm going to try and be a little bit of an optimist and hear that the economy is picking up slowly, and hopefully that can give businesses some more confidence to invest, and maybe we can get the government incentives to support both that technology and sustainability investment that's needed. Before we wrap up, I have got one final question, which I'm just going to send your way, Ben, which is, do you think that business leaders should be taking a stronger stance on these geopolitical, economic, environmental issues?
Yes, is the short answer. A strong business is symbiotic with a strong society. The two are mutually interdependent and feed one another, and it is absolutely the interest of a thriving business sector within the UK that is grounded in a strong society, and that means businesses taking an interest broader than just what they do. We have to care about the places that we're based and the communities that we call home. We have to care about the skills that are being produced, and it's right that we talk to government about the environment that would allow us to do a good job on all of those things. And I think it's also right to remind government that businesses aren't just units of GDP delivery. We have employees that we care for, their families that we care for, the cities and towns and villages that we operate in and where we sustain community and employment, and an ability to influence life chances and expectations across the country. And the more that government can think of business in that way, I think actually it can have a bigger impact across the board, especially in more constrained economic times. So yeah, absolutely. businesses should step into that space.
Brilliant, 100% agree with that, and a call to action for everybody on the call today. So that's it for today. Please visit the resources tab for all our latest insights and events. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to my guests here. We'll be back after Easter, and I hope you'll be able to join us then. Take care, everybody.